Welcome back for segment 2 of Education and Disability. What we'll do during this particular segment is we'll talk a little bit about the legislation and what it all involves in terms of ensuring that students with disabilities have the right to go to school. As we begin this new segment, one of the things I will say right off the bat is that it required laws to be passed, that laws had to be put in place to ensure that children and adults had access to education. The two laws that we will hit, and we won't go into great depth because, again, the nature of our talks and the brevity, but certainly you have a number of links to them within your course materials. The first law that was passed to guarantee access was 94-142, the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. Now, certainly not the language we would use now, but that law has subsequently been updated, and people will refer to it as IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Both of these laws were incredibly important in creating an opportunity for children to go to school. And so we're going to talk about the fundamental aspects of IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Every child has what's called access to a free and appropriate public education. That's one aspect of what this law provides. This is an incredibly important aspect of the law. It means that every child, regardless of his or her disability, is guaranteed a civil right to be educated. No child can be denied the right to an education. Another aspect of the law that's particularly important has to do with inclusion. The law also provides enforces the concept of what's called least restrictive environment, LRE. And that's the idea that we don't want to separate children with disabilities, at least as has been done historically, so that they're going to their own school and the children without disabilities go to a whole separate school. The least restrictive environment has generally been interpreted as, how do we get the students that were typically segregated and get them either mainstreamed or fully included or otherwise interacting with their non-disabled classmates. Another part of this that's important when we think about the process of how do plans get put in place, there's a staffing meeting called an Individualized Education Plan that leads to a document that says here are the resources, supports, and so on that a student is eligible to receive. I've got a lot of information on IEPs, and one of the things that I would share is that when they're being done, it's typically done in a room where the parent and sometimes the child comes in. All these professionals are sitting around the table. Each of those professionals has, particularly if we're talking about initial planning, has done an evaluation, has a report on your child, and so they give their reports. It's all well and good, except oftentimes there's a large focus on the child's weaknesses versus the strengths. And one of our guest speakers, Lori Nelson, is both a speech-language pathologist as well as a parent, and I'd like her to talk to you a little bit about the IEP process and how that works and her experience.
IEPs, or Individualized Education Plans, are part of the provisions for students with disabilities here in the United States. Every student that's identified with one or more of 16 categories of eligibility can have an individualized education plan. That's formulated by the school team, which would be the teacher, a general education teacher, a special education teacher, school psychologist, social worker, and speech-language pathologist, as well as a parent should be a very active part of that team. Once eligibility is determined, then appropriate services are decided, what accommodations are best, what interventions would be needed to help the student move forward. They are convened every year so that the plan is reviewed to make sure a child is still receiving the appropriate education in the least restrictive environment. So as a professional, I can speak about it. We first have to make sure that the child still is eligible for special education services. But as a parent, that can get beat to death. I've sat in IEP meetings where that was the only thing being discussed, was how he couldn't find his cubby and he couldn't put his coat on and he was not yet saying his name, and list of the things that he couldn't do, which I was painfully aware of, that he couldn't do these things. So I recall one meeting where I actually had, as a parent, had just really had enough, and asked to stop the meeting until everyone could refocus on what was the plan moving forward, because that should be the emphasis of the IEP meeting. What's the plan moving forward? If the child's been established as eligible, we don't need to go through all the reasons. That's a done and done conversation. So again, as a parent, it's helpful to take some control over the meetings when they become a little more deficit-oriented rather than solution-focused. Remembering that my son is 29, so things were different then than they are now for education, I chose to have him placed in actually a most restrictive environment. He could have stayed in the district in a general education classroom under the inclusion model, and he would have had a paraprofessional with him in the classroom, perhaps some minutes during the day with a special education teacher to work on some discrete skills. I chose not to do that. I felt that he would best grow and learn in a self-contained classroom in a neighboring school that was designed. The classroom was designed specifically for children like him with autism, communicative disorders. They had different interventions. They had more intrusive interventions. Rather than being able to sit passively in a general education classroom, he was kind of forced to interact and forced to do tasks that he may be reluctant to do. Now, that was, by legal definition, considered the least restrictive environment. However, for him, it gave him the opportunity to do things that students do all the time in school, to take notes to the principal's office, to collect garbage and get that ready to be taken out, to walk the halls of the school freely. Had he been in the general education environment, he would not have had that independence to do that. So in that environment, he was normal. That was a part of his day. He was like everybody else, and everyone talks to themselves, and everyone does these things, and it's fine. So for our family, that was the best choice for him. Now, he would not have been able to do that in the general education environment, likely because that would be regarded as disruptive behavior. So he would have had an adult with him reminding him to not talk to himself, to, do this, do that, do this, do that.
As we end this segment and look at our next one, what I want to summarize is that, remember, every child has a legislative right to attend school. They have a civil right to attend school, and that school, we talk about that as a free and public education provided in the least restrictive environment and guided by an agreement between the school and the parents and the child, if you will, called the Individualized Education Plan, the IEP. Now, before we get into this any further, what I would like to do is kind of back up a little bit and talk about, as we think of service provision, let's think about what happens at the very earliest ages, the birth to 3 kind of age, and we'll refer to that as early intervention. That'll be the topic of our next segment.